Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to discuss Redux Thunk. Redux Thunk is one flavor of asynchronous side effects inside of Redux. What this means is that we allow our application to fire actions, and then those actions now do not have to flow through the Redux diagram in a synchronous manner. Instead, now we get Redux bindings, which means we can read from the store or we can dispatch new actions within the actual middleware section of this Redux flow. We don't have to only figure out how to essentially coordinate these asynchronous behaviors inside of components, which is how we've done it so far. Instead, now with the middleware, you can actually do that inside of here, which opens up really powerful architecture patterns because essentially your components are purely dictating how these actions get fired. Now, what the actions do, what APIs they need to call, what asynchronous behavior needs to happen, all happens inside of middleware. So let's talk about Redux Thunk and where it fits inside of this middleware. So Redux Thunk, of course, is itself a middleware. And what it allows us to do is receive actions that are functions. It's actually very, very simple once you understand how it works. But what happens here is that we have some action, and it's going to be an asynchronous action. So instead of us dispatching an action in the typical format of an object with a type and a payload, instead we pass a function. This function goes to the Redux Thunk, and what happens is that Redux Thunk takes this function and it passes into it a dispatch. This dispatch is the same dispatch that we have used up until this point. What we do with this dispatch is now we can dispatch new actions from right inside of this Thunk. And now this new action will go back into the flow and it might hit another Thunk, or it might continue on into the subsequent Redux store and further reducers, etc. The key benefit here is that through Thunks now, we're able to abstract out some of our logic into the Thunks themselves. And this opens us up to new patterns, which we're going to cover in this video. So in order for us to begin using Thunks, we need to first add the Redux Thunk library. So while this is loading, let me explain a little bit about Redux Thunk. So earlier, if you remember inside of our store.js file, I had actually mentioned that we were essentially setting up our middleware when we wrote our logger to account for this Thunk. The reason why is because inside of logger.js, if the action has no type, then what we do is we pass the action onwards. And the reason why we do this is because all Thunks really do is allow actions to be passed as functions. So there is some middleware somewhere where inside what it does is it receives the action. So let's imagine this is Thunk middleware. And again, if you remember, it takes the format, it receives a store, it receives next, and then it receives the action. And what it does is essentially checks if action equals, or in fact, if type of action is equal to function, then what it does is it runs the action and it passes dispatch into that action so that you're able to essentially use a function as a action Thunk. So this will become more clear once we start using it. So what we do is we import Thunk from Redux Thunk. And all we need to do now is just pass this into the middleware array. And that's it. Now we can start writing Thunks. So what you want to do with Thunks is essentially you want to figure out where in your application code base you have asynchronous behavior that you can move into a action-driven flow. So here what we do is we get categories and documents when this component mounts, and then we essentially set it into our reducer when we get it back. This is the perfect opportunity to use this in a Thunk. So in order for us to do this, we actually have to modify and change up our architecture a little bit for our category reducer. So first what we need to do is we need to tell our reducer to track whether or not it is in a loading state right now for the data it will hold. So of course, by default, it won't be until something triggers it to be. And that we'll talk about when we get to the actions portion. We also need to start tracking our error states because as we do asynchronous fetching now, our reducer should be aware of whether or not an error occurred in the fetching process. So this is the first step. The next step is to modify our action types. So essentially what happens now is we are performing fetch requests. So here we're going to say, I'm going to fetch a category, but this is the start of the fetching process. So the reason why we say fetch start is because there are two possible cases that can occur during the fetch process. We can either succeed, so we say fetch category success, or we can fail. So we'll say fetch categories failed. Now, depending on what happened in this process, we will now determine whether or not we want to store the data or store an error state. So instead of setting the categories like this through an action, we're going to set it when we succeed. So let me just get rid of the set categories here, and let's modify our corresponding reducer. So what we need to think about is that we no longer are setting categories on this action. Instead, we're setting it on fetch category success. If it succeeds, then we're going to set the categories with the payload that we get from this action. The other things we need to account for, though, is also category action types dot fetch start. When we start fetching, it's essentially the time when we are beginning our API request. So this is just as we fire it, meaning that we don't know whether or not it's going to succeed or fail. So what we need to say is that is loading at this point is going to be true, because the moment that we start fetching, we are in a loading state. As for fetch category success, we want to say that it is now false, because once we get back a actual result and it's successful, then we're not loading anymore because we have now set the categories payload. And finally, we need the same thing for failure. So whenever we fail, is loading is going to be false, but the error is also going to be the error. And this will be a payload that we pass in with this action. And there we go. We have now modified our reducer in order to work with this. So now what we can do is we can actually start coming up with the actions. So as I mentioned, these actions are now going to reflect these three states, and they're also going to create a function action. So this is what we're going to do in the next video. So before we start, just think about these three states and think about whether or not this pattern makes sense to you. When we start, we're loading. If we succeed, we stop loading. We have a correct payload. If we fail, we also stop loading, but we have an error. This is going to be the fundamental basis now of the majority of our asynchronous actions when it comes to fetching inside of any Redux-based side effect library, whether it be Redux Thunk, Redux Observable, or Redux Saga. It's all going to follow this new pattern. And we're going to also talk about why in this pattern and how this is useful. So join me in the next video where we'll continue.